The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with the official seal of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Margaret Chen's hands trembled as she read the violation. Notice $500 fine for excessive weeds and unsightly landscaping conditions. But as she stared through her kitchen window at the barren dirt lot where her prized garden once flourished, a chill ran down her spine. There wasn't a single weed in sight, just empty earth, scraped clean 3 days ago by the very same HOA that now demanded payment for violations that didn't exist. What Margaret didn't know was that this wasn't a mistake. It was the opening move in a calculated game of destruction, orchestrated by someone she trusted. And when she discovers the truth, the perfectly manicured lawns of Willowbrook Estates will never look the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine sidewalks of Willowbrook Estates as Margaret Chen pulled her burgundy Honda Civic into the driveway of 1247 Maple Ridge Lane. The house looked exactly as it had when she'd left for her overnight. Shift at the hospital cream-colored siding, black shutters, and a front yard that resembled a lunar landscape. 3 days. It had been 3 days since the landscaping crew had finished their work, scraping away 30 years of her mother's carefully tended garden. 3 days since she'd watched them load the last of the rose bushes into their truck, promising they'd return Monday morning to begin the approved landscaping renovations that would bring her property into compliance with the HOA's updated aesthetic standards. Margaret's shoulders ached from 12 hours of surgery rotations, but the sight of the empty yard sent a different kind of pain through her chest. Her mother would have wept to see at the Japanese maple saplings she'd planted when Margaret was in high school, the herb garden that had supplied their family dinners for decades, the climbing roses that had covered the front fence in cascades of pink and white. All of it gone, reduced to permits and property values, and the relentless march of neighborhood improvement. She was fishing for her house keys when she noticed the white envelope tucked against her front door. Official heavy paper stock, the kind of envelope that never brought good news. Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Certified mail signature required. Margaret's hands were steadier than they'd been in the operating room just hours ago, but something about the envelope's weight made her fingers clumsy. She tore it open with more force than necessary, and the contents spilled onto her welcome mat. Notice of violation and assessment of fines. The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret sank onto her front steps, still wearing her scrubs, and read the letter 3 times before the meaning fully registered. Property address, 1247 Maple Ridge Lane. Violation date, October 15, 2024. Description, excessive weed growth, unsightly landscaping conditions, failure to maintain property in accordance with CC and RS Section 4.7.2, fine amount, $500, payment due. November 1, 2024, Margaret's laugh came out as a strangled sound. She looked up at her yard, the empty, perfectly level, completely weed-free expanse of dirt that stretched from her front door to the sidewalk. Not a dandelion in sight, not even a stray piece of grass. Her phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor, Janet Morrison, who lived in the Miramax house directly across the street. Saw you got mail from the HOA. Everything okay? Margaret's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Janet had been her mother's closest friend for 20 years, had helped plan the funeral, had been the one to suggest that updating the landscaping might help Margaret move forward after the grief. Janet was also the current president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Can you come over? I need to show you something. Janet's response came immediately. Be right there. Margaret watched through her living room window as Janet crossed the street, her silver hair caught in a perfect bob, her morning walking outfit pressed and coordinated. At 62, Janet Morrison looked like she'd stepped out of a country, club catalogal pastels and pearls and carefully maintained composure. Margaret, honey, you look exhausted, Janet said as she approached the front steps. How was your shift? Fine. Margaret held up the violation notice. Janet, I need you two look at this. Janet's expression shifted as she read, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the flush that crept up her neck. Oh my goodness, this is clearly a mistake. A mistake. Margaret's voice rose. They're fining me $500 for weeds that don't exist. Look around, Janet. Look at my yard. Janet's eyes swept across the empty lot, and for just a moment, Margaret caught something in her neighbor's expression, or calculation. But it was gone so quickly that Margaret wondered if she'd imagined it. "I'll call the office first thing Monday morning," Janet said, her voice soothing. "This is obviously an administrative error. Someone mixed up the addresses, or maybe they're using an old photo from before the landscaping work. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." Margaret's surgical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but something about Janet's dismissive tone made her chest tight. "This is a $500 fine, Janet, for violations that didn't happen. And I'm telling you, it's a mistake that I'll fix." Janet's voice carried an edge now, the same tone she used during HOA meetings when homeowners questioned her decisions. "You're tired, Margaret. You've been working double shifts dealing with your mother's estate, managing all these renovations. Maybe you should get some rest before I... What?" Margaret stood up. The violation notice crumpled in her fist. "Before I ask questions about why the HOA is sending me fraudulent fines." Fraudulent? Janet's laugh was sharp. "Margaret, really? You're being dramatic." The word hit Margaret like a slap. Dramatic. Her mother had been called dramatic when she'd questioned the HOA's decision to ban vegetable gardens. Dramatic when she'd protested the mandatory front lawn requirements. Dramatic when she'd fought to keep her climbing roses that apparently violated the new visual uniformity standards. "I want to see the photos," Margaret said quietly. "What photos?" "The ones they took to document these violations. The ones they used to justify this." "Fine." Margaret's voice was gaining strength. "There have to be photos, right? Evidence?" Janet's pause lasted a fraction too long. "I'm sure there are, somewhere in the office files. I'll look into it when I call Monday." "No." Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket. "I'm calling now. Margaret, it's Saturday morning. The office is closed. Then I'm calling the management company, and if they don't answer, I'm calling the board members. All of them." Margaret's fingers were already scrolling through her contacts. "Starting with you." Janet's perfectly composed mask finally slipped. "Margaret, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. I'm trying to help you. Are you?" Margaret looked at her neighbor, her mother's friend, the woman who'd brought casseroles during the funeral, who'd held her hand during the estate planning meetings. "Because right now, it feels like you're trying to shut me up." "I'm trying to keep you from making a fool of yourself," Janet snapped. "You're talking about fraud and conspiracies like some kind of crazy person." The words hung in the air between them, brutal and final. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a cold clarity that cut through her exhaustion and grief and confusion. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "Margaret, get off my property." Margaret's voice carried the same authority she used when a surgical resident was about to make a fatal mistake. Now, Janet's face went pale, except for 2 spots of red high on her cheekbones. She turned and walked back across the street without another word, her morning walking shoes clicking against the pavement with mechanical precision. Margaret stood in her empty yard, holding the violation notice, and felt the last of her trust in Willowbrook Estates crumble like autumn leaves. Her mother had been right to fight them. She'd been right about everything. But she'd also been alone in that fight, and they'd worn her down year by year, violation by violation, until the cancer had finished what the HOA had started. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the violation notice. She expected voicemail, but the call connected on the second ring. "Willowbrook Property Management. This is Sandra." "Hi, Sandra. This is Margaret Chen at 1247 Maple Ridge Lane. I received a violation notice today that I need to discuss with someone immediately." "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Let me pull up your file." The sound of typing came through the phone. "Yes, I see the notice that was sent. Excessive weeds and landscaping violations. The fine is $500, due November 1st. The problem is there are no weeds, no landscaping, no violations." Margaret's voice was steady, surgical. "My yard is completely empty. The previous landscaping was removed 3 days ago by an HOA-approved crew. I have the permits, the invoices, everything." Another pause, more typing. "Mrs. Chen, I'm looking at the photos that were submitted with the violation report. They show significant weed growth and unmaintained landscaping." Margaret's heartbeat accelerated. "What's the date stamp on those photos?" "October 15th, 2024. 3 days ago? That's impossible. The landscaping was removed on October 12th. The basement of 1247 Maple Ridge Lane had always been Margaret's mother's domain. Helen Chen had transformed the finished space into a combination office, craft room, and archive every surface, covered with meticulous organization systems that had served her through decades of teaching high school mathematics, but it was the filing cabinet in the corner that held the real treasure. 30 years of warfare, documented with the precision of a courtroom stenographer. Margaret pulled the first folder from the drawer, her hands steadier now than they'd been. Upstairs, the label read HOA Correspondence 1994 to 1999. In her mother's careful handwriting, inside, violation notices were arranged chronologically, each one paperclipped to Helen's handwritten response and any supporting documentation. The first notice, dated May 15, 1994, was for unauthorized vegetable plantings in front yard area. The fine, $50. Margaret could almost hear her mother's voice as she read Helen's response letter. Typed on their old electric typewriter, "Dear board members, I am writing to contest the violation notice dated May 15, 1994. In question are herbs basil, oregano, and parsley, which are commonly used in cooking and hardly different from the decorative plants permitted under current guidelines. These plants are well maintained, healthy, and contribute to the overall aesthetic of the property. I request that this violation be dismissed." The response from the board, signed by someone named Robert Kellerman, was curt. Violation upheld. Vegetables and herbs are specifically prohibited in front yard areas per CC and RS Section 4.7.1. Please remove immediately or face additional fines. Margaret flipped through the folder, watching her mother's battle unfold in real time. The herb garden violations continued through 1995, with fines escalating from $50 to $100 to $200. Helen's responses became more detailed, citing specific sections of the CC and Rs that seemed to contradict the board's interpretations, but the violations kept coming. By 1996, they had expanded beyond the herb garden. Unauthorized tree plantings, excessive height of ornamental grasses, non-compliant flower bed borders. Each violation notice was accompanied by increasingly formal language about repeat offenders and escalating enforcement procedures. Margaret opened the second folder, HOA Correspondence 2000 to 2004. The pattern was clear now. Every spring, like clockwork, violation notices would arrive. Sometimes for a legitimate oversight, a sprinkler head that needed adjustment, a fence board that required staining. But increasingly, the violations seemed designed to target the very elements that made 1247 Maple Ridge Lane distinct from its neighbors: the Japanese maple saplings, the climbing roses, the herb garden that had moved from the front yard to the side yard to the backyard, only to be declared a violation in each location for different reasons. But it was the folder labeled HOA Correspondence 2005 to 2009 that made Margaret's blood run cold. The first document wasn't a violation notice. It was a letter from Helen to the board, dated March 3, 2005. "Dear board members, I am writing to inform you of the death of my husband, David Chen. On February 28, 2005, David was responsible for much of the landscaping maintenance on our property, and I am still learning to manage these responsibilities alone. I request your patience as I work to maintain our property to community standards during this difficult time." The response, dated March 8, 2005, was signed by a new board president, Janet Morrison. "Dear Mrs. Chen, please accept our condolences on your loss. However, I must remind you that property maintenance standards apply to all residents, regardless of personal circumstances. The board cannot make exceptions based on individual hardships. We trust you will bring your property into compliance promptly." Margaret read the letter 3 times, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Her father had died of a heart attack just 5 days after Margaret had started her surgical residency. She remembered the phone call, the frantic flight home, the way her mother had seemed to shrink in the funeral home's viewing room. What she didn't remember was the HOA's response to her mother's grief, cold and bureaucratic and utterly without compassion. The violations that followed were relentless. Within 6 months of her father's death, Helen had received fines for unmaintained lawn areas, the back corner where David's workshop had been, where Helen couldn't bear to mow excessive weeds, the vegetable garden that Helen had let go. Wild in her grief and unauthorized memorial plantings the small rosebush Helen had planted in David's memory. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the next folder. The dates jumped to 2010 to 2014, and the violations had evolved. No longer simple maintenance issues, they were increasingly complex, technical, and difficult to contest. Violation of drainage requirements, non-compliant soil grading, unauthorized structural modifications to landscaping. Each violation came with fines that had escalated beyond anything reasonable: $500, $750, $1,000. And Helen's responses showed the strain. The precise, measured language of her earlier letters had given way to something more desperate, more pleading. Margaret found herself holding a letter from her mother, dated August 15, 2012. Dear Mrs. Morrison, I am writing to request a payment plan for the recent violations, totaling $2,300. As you know, I am a retired teacher living on a fixed income. These fines represent more than half of my monthly Social Security benefits. I have tried to address each issue raised by the board, but I am struggling to afford the required modifications. I have lived in this community for 18 years and have always tried to be a good neighbor. I am asking for your understanding and assistance in resolving these matters. Janet Morrison's response was typed on official letterhead. Dear Mrs. Chen, the board cannot establish individual payment plans for violation fines. These policies exist to ensure fair treatment for all residents. If you are unable to meet your financial obligations to the community, you may wish to consider whether Willowbrook Estates is the appropriate residence for your current circumstances. The board suggests consulting with a realtor about your options. Margaret's phone rang, jarring her from the documents. She glanced at the screen. Janet Morrison. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. Then she swiped to answer. Margaret, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. Janet's voice was carefully modulated, the tone she used for difficult neighbors. I may have been a little harsh. You're going through a lot right now, and I want you to know that I'm here to help. Are you? Margaret kept her voice neutral as she flipped through more of her mother's files. Because I'm sitting here reading 30 years of correspondence between my mother and the HOA, and I'm starting to understand what kind of help you've been providing. A pause. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean the letter you sent my mother. In 2012, suggesting she sell her house because she couldn't afford the fines you were imposing on her. Margaret's voice was steady, surgical. I mean the violations you sent her 6 months after my father died, when she was barely able to function. Margaret, you're taking things out of context. Those were different times, different circumstances, different board presidents. Margaret interrupted. Because your name is on a lot of these letters, Janet, going back 15 years. The silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Janet spoke, and her voice was more controlled. Your mother was a difficult woman, Margaret. She fought every reasonable request, ignored community standards, and frankly made life difficult for everyone around her. The board tried to work with her, but she was stubborn and unreasonable. Stubborn and unreasonable. Margaret repeated the words slowly. Is that what you called it when she couldn't afford to replace her entire front yard because you decided her plants were suddenly non-compliant? The community's standards evolved over time to protect property values for everyone. Your mother refused to adapt. Adapt, Margaret laughed, and the sound was harsh in the basement's fluorescent lighting. You mean surrender? You wanted her to surrender everything that made her happy, everything that made her home feel like home, so that your property values could go up by another 2%. You're being dramatic, Margaret, just like she was. There was that word again, dramatic. Margaret stood up, still holding one of her mother's violation notices, and walked to the small basement window that looked out onto the backyard, the yard where her mother had spent countless hours tending plants that brought her joy, fighting an endless battle against people who saw that joy as a threat to their investment portfolios. Janet, I want you to listen to me very carefully, Margaret said, her voice carrying the same authority she used when delivering a terminal diagnosis. I'm going to contest this violation notice. I'm going to demand the photos. I'm going to review every single interaction between my mother and this board for the past 30 years. And if I find what I think I'm going to find, if I discover that this has been a systematic campaign of harassment designed to force my family out of this neighborhood, I'm going to take action. What kind of action? The kind that involves lawyers and depositions and public records requests, the kind that gets reported in newspapers and discussed at city council meetings, the kind that asks very uncomfortable questions about how an HOA. Margaret had performed surgery for 12 hours straight without a break, had delivered death sentences to patients' families, had kept her hands steady while removing tumors from beating hearts. But sitting in her mother's chair at 7:30 p.m., watching the board members file into Janet Morrison's living room across the street, she felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with medical emergencies. Through Janet's front window, she could see the familiar silhouettes gathering around the dining room table. Robert Kellerman, whose name had been on violation notices since 1994, a tall man with silver hair who'd retired from banking and treated HOA business like hostile takeovers. Patricia Hayes. Michael Torres, the newest member, a corporate lawyer in his 40s, moved to Willowbrook Estates specifically for the well-maintained community standards. And Janet Morrison, presiding over it all like a queen holding court. Margaret's laptop was open on the coffee table, her mother's files spread around her in organized stacks. She'd spent the afternoon scanning documents, creating and building what would have been a prosecutor's dream case, but she'd also been making phone calls, and the responses had been illuminating. The first call had been to Dr. Patricia Wang, Helen's oncologist. Margaret had expected medical confidentiality barriers, but Dr. Wang had been surprisingly forthcoming. "Your mother was under tremendous stress during her treatment," Dr. Wang had said. She kept apologizing for missing appointments because she had to attend HOA meetings. She was so worried about the fines that she delayed some of her treatments because she couldn't afford both the medical bills and the violation penalties. I tried to tell her that her health was more important, but she was convinced they would foreclose on her house if she didn't comply. The second call had been to Helen's neighbor from 2 houses down, Mrs. Emily Rodriguez, who'd apparently been documenting the HOA's treatment of Helen for years. "I tried to help her," Mrs. Rodriguez had said, her voice thick with emotion. "I went to board meetings. I spoke up when they were being unfair, but they just ignored me. They wanted her gone, Dr. Chen. They thought her house was too ethnic, too different from the rest of the neighborhood. They never said it outright, but we all knew too ethnic." Margaret had stared at those words in her notes, feeling a cold rage settle in her chest. Her parents had been the first Asian family in Willowbrook Estates, had faced subtle discrimination that they'd never talked about but that Margaret now understood had been much worse than she'd realized. The third call had been to the investigative reporter at the local newspaper, Jessica Martinez, who'd been more interested this time around. "I remember your mother," Jessica had said. "She called me about 5 years ago, but I didn't have enough evidence to run a story. If you've got documentation going back 30 years, that changes things. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Now, as Margaret watched the board meeting unfold across the street, she felt the surgical calm that preceded every major operation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sandra at the property management company. "They're discussing a special assessment for your property. Something about emergency landscaping requirements and expedited compliance procedures. Mrs. Morrison is pushing for a $5,000 fine if you don't hire their preferred contractor within 48 hours. $5,000 for an empty yard." Fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency. She pulled up the Willowbrook Estates community website and logged into the resident portal using her mother's credentials, which she'd found in the files. The password was Marjadoc, 1992, the year Margaret had started medical school. The resident portal had a community message board that Margaret had never used, but she'd seen her mother check it obsessively in her final years. Now she understood. Why? It was where the board posted updates, where residents could voice concerns, and where community announcements were made. Margaret began typing, "Dear Willowbrook Estates residents, my name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and I live at 1247 Maple Ridge Lane. Many of you knew my mother, Helen Chen, who lived in this community for 30 years until her death earlier this year. I am writing to inform you about a serious situation that affects every resident of our community. 3 days ago, I received a violation notice and $500 fine for excessive weeds and unsightly landscaping conditions on my property. The problem is that my yard is completely empty. No plants, no weeds, nothing. The landscaping was removed with full HOA approval on October 12th, and the alleged violations were supposedly photographed on October 15th. When I contacted the property management company, I was told that photos documenting these violations exist, but they were uploaded to the system outside normal procedures. In other words, someone submitted falsified evidence to justify a fine that should not exist. This is not an isolated incident. I have spent today reviewing 30 years of correspondence between my mother and the HOA board. What I discovered is a systematic campaign of harassment that included escalating fines for increasingly absurd violations, including wind chimes and bird feeders, cruel and dismissive responses to requests for compassion during family emergencies, suggestions that my mother sell her home rather than continue to contest unreasonable violations, financial pressure that forced my mother to delay medical treatment to pay HOA fines. I am currently working with legal counsel to address these issues. But I believe every resident has a right to know how their HOA board has been operating and to understand that what happened to my family could happen to any of you. The board is meeting tonight to discuss escalated enforcement procedures for my property. I encourage any interested residents to attend future board meetings and to ask questions about how violation procedures are documented and enforced. I will be happy to share documentation with any resident who is interested in learning more about these issues. Sincerely, Dr. Margaret Chen, 1247 Maple Ridge Lane, * Margaret's finger hovered over the post button for only a moment before clicking it. Within minutes, her phone began ringing. The first call was from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Dr. Chen, I just saw your post. Thank you for speaking up. I've been keeping my own records of board meetings, and I'd like to share them with you." The second call was from a resident Margaret didn't know. "Dr. Chen, this is Tom Bradley from Elm Street. I've been getting increasingly ridiculous violations over the past 2 years. I thought I was going crazy, but after reading your post, I'm wondering if there's a pattern." The third call was from Janet Morrison, and her voice was shaking with rage. "Margaret, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm informing my neighbors about HOA procedures," Margaret replied calmly. "Is there a problem with that? You've posted confidential information about board deliberations on a public forum. That's a violation of community guidelines." "Which community guidelines?" "I've read the CCNRs, and I don't see anything prohibiting residents from discussing their experiences with the board. You're spreading false information and defaming board members. We're going to have to take action." Margaret felt the cold satisfaction of a surgeon who'd found the tumor. What kind of action? Emergency powers allow the board to impose immediate fines and restrictions when residents engage in disruptive behavior. We're prepared to use those powers. "Janet, let me ask you something. Are you recording this conversation?" "What? No. Of course not." "Good, because I am." Margaret tapped her phone's recording app. "And I want to make sure I have your threat to impose emergency fines as retaliation for my protected speech clearly documented." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if Janet had hung up. Finally, Janet spoke, and her voice was different, more controlled, but with an undertone of something that might have been fear. "Margaret, you're making a mistake. You don't understand the legal complexities involved in community management. You're going to hurt yourself and potentially face significant financial consequences." "Are you threatening me, Janet?" "I'm warning you, as a friend of your mother's. I'm trying to protect you from making decisions you'll regret." Margaret looked across the street at Janet's living room window, where she could see the board members still gathered around the dining room table. "You were never my mother's friend. A friend wouldn't have spent 30 years tormenting her. A friend wouldn't have suggested she sell her house when she was grieving. A friend wouldn't have fined her for wind chimes when she was dying of cancer. Your mother was a difficult woman. My mother was a 70-year-old retired teacher who wanted to grow herbs in her garden, and you destroyed her for it." Margaret ended the call and immediately opened her laptop to check the community message board. Her post had generated 17 comments in the 30 minutes since she'd posted it. Most were supportive, but a few were clearly from board allies trying to discredit her. "Dr. Chen, I'm sorry for your loss, but you're clearly emotional and not thinking clearly. The board works hard to maintain our property values, and your mother was consistently non-compliant with community standards. Patricia Hayes, as a real estate professional, I can tell you that communities with strict..." Margaret woke at 5:47 a.m. to the sound of her doorbell ringing insistently. She'd slept in her mother's chair, surrounded by legal documents and laptop screens. her phone charging on the coffee table next to a cold cup of coffee and the emergency violation notice that had started everything. Through the front window, she could see a news van parked across the street, its satellite dish extended like a mechanical flower reaching toward the dawn sky. A woman in a red blazer was standing on Margaret's front porch holding a microphone and looking remarkably alert for someone who'd apparently been working since before sunrise. Margaret's phone showed 47 missed calls, 63 text messages, and 127 email notifications. The community message board post that had started as a simple appeal to neighbors had somehow become a viral social media phenomenon overnight. She opened the door to find Jessica Martinez, the investigative reporter she'd spoken to yesterday, along with a cameraman who was already rolling. "Dr. Chen, I'm Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News. We spoke yesterday about your mother's situation. With the HOA, I apologize for the early hour, but this story has exploded overnight. Can you give us a statement about the recording that's been circulating on social media?" Margaret blinked. "What recording?" Jessica pulled out her phone and played back audio that Margaret recognized immediately, Janet Morrison's voice, clear and sharp. "Your mother thought she was better than everyone else. She thought her exotic plants and her ethnic cooking smells and her foreign ways were more important than community standards. Someone posted this on TikTok around midnight," Jessica explained. "It's been shared over 200,000 times. The hashtag Willowbrook racism is trending nationally." Margaret stared at the phone, watching the view counter tick upward in real time. She hadn't posted the recording anywhere, which meant someone else had access to it, someone who'd been listening. "Dr. Chen, are you willing to go on camera too? Discuss your family's experience with the HOA." Margaret looked past Jessica to the news van, then across the street to Janet Morrison's house, where she could see figures moving behind closed curtains. 3 more news vans were pulling into the neighborhood, and neighbors were emerging from their houses to see what was happening. "Give me 10 minutes to get dressed," Margaret said, "and yes, I'll tell you everything." As Margaret showered and changed into professional clothes, her phone continued buzzing. Text from her department chief saw the news. "Take all the time you need. Legal says hospital supports you 100%. Text from her legal aid attorney. FBI Civil Rights Division wants to meet today. Can you come in at 2 p.m.? Text from Mrs. Rodriguez. The whole neighborhood is watching the news. People are furious. Board meeting tonight, everyone's coming." But it was the text from Sandra at the property management company that made Margaret pause. "Dr. Chen, I need to tell you something. The board held another emergency meeting at 6 a.m. They're planning to claim you illegally recorded them and file criminal charges. But I have something they don't know I have. Can we meet?" Margaret was tying her shoes when she heard raised voices. Outside, through the window, she could see Janet Morrison standing in her driveway, gesticulating angrily at the news crews while Robert Kellerman and Patricia Hayes flanked her like bodyguards. Michael Torres was notably absent. Margaret opened her front door and stepped onto the porch. The effect was immediate. Every camera swung toward her, and the ambient noise of the gathering crowd dropped to an expectant hush. "Dr. Chen." "Jessica." Martinez approached with her microphone. "Can you tell us about the recording where HOA board president Janet Morrison made racist comments about your mother?" "The recording speaks for itself," Margaret said, her voice carrying easily across the yard. "For 30 years, my mother endured systematic harassment from this HOA board because she was different, because she grew herbs instead of roses, because she cooked food that smelled ethnic, because she refused to erase her culture to make her neighbors more comfortable." Janet Morrison's voice cut across the street. "That's a lie. Mrs. Chen was repeatedly non-compliant with community standards that apply to everyone." Margaret looked directly at Janet, and when she spoke, her voice had the same authority she used when teaching surgical residents. "Mrs. Morrison, on that recording, you specifically mentioned my mother's exotic plants and foreign ways. Would you'd like to explain to these reporters what community standard prohibits being Asian?" The silence that followed was broken only by the clicking of camera shutters. Janet's face had gone pale except for 2 spots of red high on her cheekbones. "I never said anything about her being Asian," Janet stammered. "This is being taken out of context. The recording is available in full," Margaret replied. "Everyone can listen and decide for themselves what context makes racist comments acceptable." Patricia Hayes stepped forward. Dr. Chen, you illegally recorded a private conversation. That's a criminal offense in this state. Margaret felt the cold satisfaction of a surgeon who'd anticipated every complication. Actually, Mrs. Hayes, I announced that I was recording the conversation before it began. Mrs. Morrison acknowledged it and continued speaking. The recording is completely legal. You manipulated the situation to entrap honest board members who were trying to serve their community. Robert Kellerman added, his banker's precision cracking under pressure. I documented public officials in the performance of their duties, Margaret corrected, which is not only legal, it's a public service. Jessica Martinez stepped closer. Dr. Chen, can you tell us about the specific violations your mother faced? Over the years, Margaret had spent her career explaining complex medical situations to families in crisis. This wasn't different, just a different kind of diagnosis, a different kind of treatment plan. My mother was fined for growing herbs in her garden, for planting memorial roses after my father died, for hanging wind chimes that reminded her of her childhood in Taiwan. They fined her for bird feeders, for decorative stones, for having a vegetable garden in her backyard where no one could even see it. Margaret's voice remained steady, but she could feel 30 years of suppressed anger giving it weight. They suggested she sell her house rather than continue to contest violations that were designed to drive her away. How much did these fines total over the years? Margaret had done the math yesterday. Over 30 years, approximately $47,000 in fines and legal fees. For a retired teacher living on Social Security, that was devastating. A murmur ran through the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the news coverage. Margaret could see shock on familiar faces, people who'd lived next to her mother for decades, but had never known the full extent of what Helen had endured. And you believe this was racially motivated? Mrs. Morrison's own words make that clear. But even before the recording, the pattern was obvious. The violations targeted elements of my mother's gardening that reflected her cultural background. The board never fined anyone for having rose gardens or traditional American landscaping. Only my mother's exotic choices were problems. Janet Morrison had apparently heard enough. She strode across the street, her morning walking outfit replaced by a severe black suit that made her look like she was attending a funeral. Dr. Chen, you are destroying this community with your accusations and your publicity stunts. We are prepared to take legal action to protect the reputation of Willowbrook Estates and its board members. Margaret looked at Janet Trilly, at her, and saw something she recognized from the operating room. The desperate aggression of someone who knew they were losing but couldn't admit it. Mrs. Morrison, what legal action are you planning? Defamation, harassment, and criminal. Wiretapping for starters. On what grounds? You've made false and damaging statements about board members who are following established procedures. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app. For the record, Mrs. Morrison, are you denying that you made the statements? Captured in the recording that's currently trending on social media. Janet's eyes flicked to the news cameras, then back to Margaret. I'm not discussing anything further without my attorney present. But you just threatened to file criminal charges against me. Surely you can explain the basis for those charges. I don't have to explain anything to you. Actually, you do. The voice came from behind Margaret, and she turned to see a man in a dark suit approaching the group. Agent David Park, FBI Civil Rights Division. Mrs. Morrison, we'd like to speak with you about potential violations of federal fair housing laws. The effect on the crowd was electric. Phones came out, cameras refocused, and Janet Morrison looked like she was about to faint. Federal, Patricia Hayes squeaked. This is just a neighborhood dispute. Agent Park looked at Patricia with the kind of polite interest that Margaret recognized from her own professional interactions. The careful neutrality that preceded very bad news. Mrs. Hayes, when housing discrimination is motivated by racial or ethnic bias, it becomes a federal matter. Dr. Chen's documentation suggests a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that may violate the Fair Housing Act. Robert Kellerman stepped forward, his banker's instincts finally kicking in. Agent Park, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. The board has always applied community standards uniformly to all residents.